When I first saw the launch trailer for Frogun, I decided that this was a game I needed right away. This isn't something I normally do, I usually wait for a sale or something, but I'm a sucker for low polygon 3D graphics and simplistic platforming games. I got just that, but not without a few problems. As much as I love Frogun, there are a few too many issues. The story follows Renata, daughter of two explorers who have gone missing in an ancient ruin. After awaiting their return for 2 days, Renata takes matters into her own hands and searches for her parents, with the titular Frogun in tow. There's a little bit more to the story than it might initially seem. You collect notes that expand on the lore, the bosses have their own dialogue, and Renata's rival, Jake, plays a slightly larger role towards the end. None of this gets in the way or interrupts the gameplay too much, and it's just enough to help keep things interesting. It's pretty well done. The rest of the presentation is mostly great. If you're not a fan of the low polygon 3D style, then this one isn't going to change your mind, but I find the aesthetic to be so charming. All the characters and enemies have these big eyes and are so expressive, even if the animations are limited. Aside from how smooth the camera control is, this really does feel like it could have been an old school PS1 game. And the cherry on top for that is the file size. A modern 3D game clocking in at under half a gig is very impressive. The music fits in line with this too. Nothing too crazy, I've heard better soundtracks elsewhere, but it is appropriate for the game, and a couple of the songs are actually pretty sick. I wish the music would loop better, but it does do good enough at that. There are also these special opening and ending cutscenes, which are kind of okay. They're just so different from everything else, but they don't look bad at all. It's a good looking game overall, the presentation is top notch. The gameplay is simply a case of getting from point A to point B with a bunch of optional challenges along the way. You can try to complete the time trial, collect all the treasure in the level, or beat the level without dying. Control-wise, you only really need to use 2 buttons, jump and shoot. There's an optional 3rd button for manual aiming, but I've found that to be pretty unnecessary. You can't remap the control layout at all, which is baffling to me, but I'm glad they included an option to jump and shoot with the shoulder buttons, which I would argue is a necessity to get good at for the later levels. It helps so much to have constant control over the camera in this game, so you never want your thumbs off the joysticks. Although, as a side note, I found the game to be much easier to control movement with the D-pad. Give that a shot if you're having a hard time. The level design and general pace of the game is like Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, only a lot faster, larger, more open, and way more action. Both games have an emphasis on exploration and sniffing out secrets, but while Captain Toad is far more limiting, Frogun is much closer to a traditional platformer. That said, both games have a similar vibe where everything is broken up into smaller, blocky islands. In that sense, it also reminds me a bit of Super Mario Galaxy and how much of the game involves hopping from planet to planet, although it's clearly nowhere near as fast-paced or acrobatic. Anyway, for what Frogun is going for, I like it. It keeps the adventure large, but still bite-sized and manageable. The frog gun itself represents the game's key gimmick, and it's essentially a grappling hook or a hook shot from Legend of Zelda. You can pull lighter items like boxes towards you, or you can zip across gaps by shooting a wall or larger enemies. The smaller items and enemies can be grabbed and thrown as projectiles. Much like the rest of the game, this mechanic is kept very simple, but they do manage to take it pretty far. Later levels task the player with jumping and grappling across multiple platforms in a row, with one mistake leading to an instant death. These are definitely some of the more challenging parts of the game, but it's cool once you get used to it. That's about the whole overview. Like I already said, it's very simple, but it uses that simplicity as its main strength fairly well. Unfortunately, there are more than a few flaws holding it back, some having to do with the game's foundation, and others due to some straight-up game-breaking bugs. While the level design and variety are pretty good, especially with how the game manages to introduce new gimmicks and stage hazards, about the first quarter of the game is way too easy. One thing is to try to ease the player in, but Frogun takes a little too long to ramp things up. You can definitely get a good idea of the direction they're going for by level 3, but it's not until about level 20 that it starts to get challenging. There's around 40 levels in the game, so it's only the latter half when it starts to get good. The game as a whole isn't bad for this, but you do have to give it time for Frogun to start showing its teeth. The overall easy difficulty also extends to the boss fights. The vast majority of them merely involve dodging the boss's attacks in preset patterns, and then hitting them when they're open. There's not much that can be done to speed this up, and it doesn't really feel like you're actively engaged in battle. It's much more about dodging and pattern memorization. The much later bosses are really cool and challenging, but even so, it's still not too big of a deal. The racing levels might be more appropriate as boss fights, as Renata races against her rival to complete the level before he does. But it comes down to little else than a specialized time trial, only with the added annoyance of an enemy you can't kill that also gets in your way and deals damage on contact. As cool as the racing levels are, it is pretty silly considering that each level already has its own optional time trial challenge, so having several levels based around racing a rival seems a little pointless. Of course, challenge is one thing, but the game does feel like it comes close to being unfair at times. In particular, these multi-jump sections, which I brought up earlier, they do take a while to get used to, but even then, it's possible and so frustrating to miss your mark by just a tiny amount. All of these segments lead to an instant death if you miss, and it can get really bad if you're trying to go for a no-death run. Speaking of which, attaining 100% completion always means doing each level a minimum of 2 or 3 times, if not more for the trickier ones. This isn't as bad as it sounds since most of the levels are short, especially once you know what you're doing, but it doesn't change the fact that you'll be repeating each of them several times. None of these aspects are necessarily bad per se. Like, they're not great, but it's certainly not enough to bring down the game too much. What's a more serious issue are all the glitches. Put simply, this game, at least the PlayStation 5 version, was not shipped in a ready state. Going so far as to the point where I can't actually finish all the levels. Although rare, there are moments when the game will soft lock, trapping the player in a hole and forcing a restart of the level. You don't even get the option to go back to a previous checkpoint if you wanted to. If this only happened once or twice, then I would just give it a brief mention and leave it at that, but it definitely happened a little too often to be excusable. There's also this really late boss against a giant frog. For some reason, whenever I collect all the treasure in this level, the game always crashes upon defeating this boss. The game is supposed to transition into a cutscene, but Renata instead starts walking into the water aimlessly. In this situation, I can't even pause the game. I have to close out the entire application. But the final straw is when I finally unlock the boss rush, one of the last levels of the game, only to find it literally unbeatable. This boss glitches out and refuses to complete his attack pattern. Not even counting all the extra content to achieve 100% completion, I can't even progress further in this epilogue chapter to finally close the game out. There's smaller stuff too, like how the music overlaps itself during the ending cutscene and sounds really bad, or how, for whatever reason, this level doesn't have any music at all. I don't know what the state of the game is on other platforms, but I would suggest waiting for an update to fix all these bugs before you give yourself any needless frustration. It's such a shame because I like this game a lot. It controls well, the presentation is great, and it's simple and fun. Little things like the silly poses in the photo mode and how detailed the overworld map design is, it helps go a long way towards making the game so soulful and cheerful. I've reviewed a couple of games already that are essentially meant to be kids games, but they always fall short for one reason or another. But here's one that's actually good. My gripes with the difficulty, some select level design choices, and the bare bones boss fights all manage to be overcome by the solid controls and the overall quality of the game. And all for a pretty reasonable price of only $15. Personally, I want to give this game a 7 out of 10, maybe even an 8 out of 10 if I'm feeling generous, but I think a 7 out of 10 is a fair score with all things considered. The game isn't anything too special, but it does manage to pull off its goals quite well. However, sadly, the game-breaking bugs bring down the whole package really hard. Honestly, the game still manages to be enjoyable anyway, as long as you're okay with potentially repeating some levels for no good reason, but that's not an excuse. Well, hopefully that update comes out sooner than later. Thanks for watching my review on Frogun.